You don't forget the moment it breaks. Maybe it was a phone call that changed everything. The silence after an argument that was supposed to be just another fight, the hospital bed, the empty hallway. The night you laid awake knowing nothing would ever go back to how it was. Not because you wanted change, but because something inside you cracked wide open. And the world you knew didn't fit anymore. You try to explain it, but the words don't land. People nod, they say the usual things. Time heals, you're strong. But inside, you're not looking for platitudes. You're looking for the person you were before it happened. And that person is gone. This is what Carl Jung called the rupture of the ego, the breakdown of the image we've spent our lives protecting. Not because we failed, but because the unconscious has something more honest it wants us to face. He wrote, "My life was the story of the self-realization of the unconscious." What burst forth and threatened to break me? You don't break for no reason. The wound is not senseless, it is not random, it is sacred. But that's not how it feels when you're standing in the ashes. In the beginning, it feels like collapse, like isolation, like being trapped inside a version of yourself you never chose. So you try to hold it together, you work harder, you smile sharper. You become strong in all the ways people admire, just enough to convince them you're okay, and maybe even convince yourself. But there's a moment, always, that the mask stops fitting. That's where this story begins. Not the story of your success. Not the story of your image, the real story. The one that started when the fracture came. The one you stopped telling because even you didn't know what it meant. But you feel it, don't you? That quiet ache that shows up in the stillness. That strange grief that has no name but colors everything. The part of you that wants to move on but keeps circling back to the wound because part of you knows there's something there you haven't faced yet. This is not weakness, this is initiation. In myth, there's a figure named Chiron, a centaur, half man, half god, who was struck by a poisoned arrow. Immortal and unable to die, he lived with a wound that never healed. But from that pain, he became the greatest healer of his age. Not because he was cured, because he transformed. His suffering became his service. His scar became a source of wisdom. And in the end, the gods honored him, not by erasing his pain, but by placing him in the stars. Chiron's wound became his constellation. That's what the sacred wound does. It marks you. It undoes the life you had planned, so the life you are meant to live can begin. You are not being punished, you are being reshaped. So if you're here, standing in the space between who you were and who you're becoming, this isn't your undoing. This is your passage. And what waits on the other side begins now. You don't just fall apart when the wound arrives. You start running, not down a hallway or into the night. You run inward into the masks, the distractions, the performance of being fine. Because when the sacred wound breaks you open, the first thing most of us do is try to put ourselves back together too fast. You tell yourself it wasn't that bad. You smile wider. You stay busy. You work harder. You say all the right things, especially to yourself. I've got this. I'm moving on. I'm stronger now. But inside, you're negotiating with silence. You know it's still there. That ache behind your accomplishments. That tired smile after another good day that somehow still feels hollow. That part of you that wakes up at 3 a.m. Not in panic, but in recognition. Something's wrong and no one can see it. Carl Jung called this the persona, the mask we wear to meet the world. It's not false, exactly, it's just partial. It's the version of you that's been shaped by expectation, praise, survival. But here's the truth, the mask isn't the problem. It's the fact that we start to believe it's us. And the longer you run, the more exhausting it becomes to hold together what was never real to begin with. Have you felt that? The moment the pretending costs more than the pain itself? This isn't weakness, it's the fire finally catching up. In Japanese mythology, there's a story about Izanagi and Izanami, the first man and woman bound by love and loss. When Izanami dies giving birth to a fire god, Izanagi descends into the underworld to bring her back. But when he sees what she's become in death, decay, shadow, something too raw to face, he recoils. He runs and he seals the door behind him, forever dividing himself from the truth he couldn't hold. That's what we do when we glimpse the full truth of our pain. We slam the door, we try to forget. We run not away from something dangerous, but toward something numb. But the sacred wound doesn't stay buried. It waits, it surfaces in ways you don't expect. In the relationships you sabotage, the overwork that burns you out, the quiet you can't sit in, the joy that feels just out of reach. It starts to whisper, you left something behind, something sacred. And no matter how many layers of healing you stack on top, if it was built on avoidance, it eventually cracks. Because the path back isn't forward, it's through. So let's ask what most won't. What if your pain isn't here to be managed or medicated, but to be met? What if the part of you you've been trying to silence is the part trying to bring you home? That's not a metaphor, it's a return, a sacred one. And it begins not with transcendence, but with a single, terrifying, beautiful act. Stopping, right here, right now. So if you're tired of running, don't take another step. Sit with it, look at what followed you. And if you're still here, still reading, still listening, type, I'm done running below. Let someone else see they're not the only one. Because this isn't weakness, this is the beginning of courage. There's a moment when everything stops working, not suddenly, not dramatically, but quietly, like a light that flickers too long before finally going out. The affirmations no longer soothe. The therapy tools fall flat. The books feel hollow. Even your strength, the one thing you could always rely on, it turns silent. This isn't a breakdown you can cry your way out of. This is the moment you realize you can't fix this. And the part of you that spent years outrunning the wound finally understands you've arrived at the place you were trying not to find. Carl Jung called this ego death, the collapse of the mask. The disintegration of everything you built to survive. But here's what no one tells you. When you lose the version of yourself that wasn't true, there's no one left to pretend for you. And that's terrifying. Because now it's just you, just the silence, just the wound you never looked at. This is the sacred pause, the threshold. The place in the journey where you're not ascending, you're dissolving. And the map you've always used no longer applies. You're not lost, you're in the abyss. David White called this a seasonal state of repair. But when you're in it, it doesn't feel like repair, it feels like vanishing. Like being erased from your own story. You still go to work, you still smile, you still text back, but inside it's gone quiet. No answers, no spark, no promise that things will make sense again. And yet somewhere in that stillness something different begins to stir. Not hope, not yet. But a strange kind of honesty. This is the descent. The part the hero never brags about. The part you don't post about. The part that asks, what if there's no going back? And that question matters. Because the truth is, there isn't. You've seen too much, felt too deeply. Broken too open to ever pretend again. In mythology, this is where Skeleton Woman lives. Cast into the depths of the sea, bone by bone, forgotten, feared, her voice long gone. Not a monster, just a memory, waiting to be reassembled. And the fisherman, he doesn't understand what he's pulled from the water. He runs, but she follows. Not because she's haunting him, but because he touched something real, and real doesn't let go. You're the fisherman now, when the wound has surfaced. This is the part where people usually quit, where they say, I guess I'm just broken and numb out again. where they go back to pretending. But if you've made it this far, I'm asking you not to quit, because the abyss is not empty. It's full of everything you were never allowed to feel. And it's waiting, not to hurt you, to hold you. Francis Weller wrote, "Grief offers a wild alchemy that transmutes suffering into fertile ground." But the alchemy doesn't begin with answers. It begins with the ache. So if that's where you are, if nothing makes sense and the silence is deafening, this isn't the end of your story. This is the beginning of something only the darkness could teach. And if you're still with me, type "I'm in the abyss" in the comments, not for attention, for remembrance. Because this is the part of the journey no one applauds. But it's the part that will save you. Not every transformation begins with a fire. Sometimes it begins with a tear, a quiet moment, a soft break. The kind of release that doesn't come from screaming, but from finally putting down the weight you were never meant to carry alone. Because after the collapse, something strange happens. You don't find peace, you find silence. Not the empty kind, the kind that listens. And that's when the sacred wound begins to speak. Not to punish you, not to lecture you, but to remind you of what was forgotten when you put on the mask. This is the turning. Not forward, not upward, inward. Carl Jung wrote, "In all chaos there is a cosmos. In an all disorder, a secret order." He meant that when life seems most undone, it may be preparing you to meet the truth you could never reach through control. And the truth is this, you don't need fixing, you need facing. The sacred wound doesn't want to be erased. It wants to be seen, really seen. Maybe that's why you're still here, why nothing else worked. Because the only thing you haven't done is stop running and listen. There's a story. One you may have heard in fragments. An old Inuit myth kept alive through whispers and firelight. A fisherman casts his line and pulls something strange from the sea. Bones. A twisted, broken skeleton, once a woman, now forgotten. He recoils, horrified. He runs, but the bones follow. Because the real things always do. Eventually, the man collapses in exhaustion. And in the quiet of the cave, he turns and looks, and something changes. He doesn't fix her, he weeps. And in that moment, skeleton woman drinks his tear and begins to reassemble, bone to bone, breath to breath, scar to voice. She sings herself back to life. Not because he saved her, but because he finally saw her, held space, offered presence without condition. That's what the sacred wound is waiting for, not solutions, not explanations. Your presence, your tear, your willingness to stop treating the pain as a problem and start treating it as a portal. Robert A. Johnson wrote, "To honor and accept one's own shadow is a profound spiritual discipline. It is whole-making and thus holy." The shadow isn't your flaw, it's your forgotten power. And when you finally look at it, not with judgment but with compassion, it doesn't devour you. It begins to remember you. Maybe your skeleton woman wasn't a myth. Maybe she was a childhood memory, a betrayal you never forgave, a version of yourself you left behind because the world couldn't hold her. But she's still here, and she's waiting for your tear. So if you're feeling something right now, if your chest feels heavier, your breath a little more tender, don't scroll past it. Stay, let it soften you, let it rise. And if it does, if a part of you is reassembling right now, write the word "return" in the comments, not to be seen, but to mark the place where you stopped running, where you finally turned, and where something in you, something sacred, began to sing again. You don't walk out of the abyss the same. You crawl, you rise. You learn to stand again, but slower this time, quieter. Not because you're weak, but because you've seen something you can't unsee. The truth of yourself. The parts you buried. The wounds you denied. The beauty that still existed, even inside the ruin. And now everything feels different. You don't look healed. You don't need to. You look honest. Carl Jung called this the process of individuation, the integration of all you are, not just the parts you've polished. It's not about becoming perfect, it's about becoming whole. The sacred wound hasn't disappeared, but it no longer defines you. It guides you. You start to understand that pain was never the enemy, it was the invitation. And now that you've answered it, your life begins to rearrange. Not loudly, not suddenly, but unmistakably. You pause before you speak. You feel more than you fix. You sit longer in silence, not because you have nothing to say, but because you've realized not everything needs to be filled. This is what it means to carry the scar with grace, not to hide it, to live through it. There's a Japanese art called kintsugi, where broken pottery is repaired with gold. Not to erase the crack, but to reveal it. To show where the object was once broken and where it became more because of it. That's what your scar becomes now. Not a flaw, a signature. Not a weakness, a map. Not something to be ashamed of, but something that says, I walked through fire and I didn't come back empty. You begin to see others differently too. Not as people to judge or fix, but as mirrors, carriers of their own hidden fractures. And suddenly you know how to be with them. Not by saying the right thing, but by simply being there. Because that's what the wound taught you. Presence, depth, compassion that doesn't perform. You've become the wounded healer, not in theory, but in practice. Like Chiron, who lived with an incurable wound, yet helped others find their way. Who gave up his immortality not in defeat, but in offering. Who was lifted into the stars not as a symbol of perfection, but as a constellation of what it means to endure and transform. You carry a scar the way he carried his, quietly, humbly, but visibly. Because now it's not about proving anything, it's about being something. Real, rooted, returned. And when the ache revisits you, as it will, you won't panic, you'll recognize it. You'll welcome it like an old companion, and it will not take you down. It will remind you that the wound never broke you, it revealed you. You don't return from the sacred wound with fireworks, you return with stillness, with slower steps. With eyes that see differently and a voice that no longer needs to shout to be heard. There's no grand finish line, just a quieter self. One that no longer performs healing, but lives it. You begin to realize that wholeness was never about becoming someone new. It was about remembering who you were before the world taught you to hide. Carl Jung believed that the soul's path is not linear, it is spiral. That we are brought back again and again, not to be punished, but to deepen, to integrate, to love more fiercely what we once feared. You've seen your shadow. Not from a distance, but up close. And now it doesn't scare you. Because the thing you used to run from is the thing that brought you home. And when people ask you how you made it through, you won't hand them a formula. You'll hand them a pause, a presence, a space wide enough for their own pain to land. Because you no longer need to explain the scar. You embody its wisdom in how you listen, in what you no longer chase, in the way your strength is now made of softness. This is what happens when the sacred wound becomes your path. You move differently. Not to be noticed, but because you no longer have to defend anything. You stopped needing to be inspiring. You just started being real. And that is what heals others. Not your words, your being. Like Chiron, like the fisherman, like all the pilgrims before you, you walk not to arrive, but to carry. To carry what others still believe they must run from. To become, without trying, a reminder that it's possible. Possible to hurt and still rise. Possible to feel and still lead. Possible to break and still love. And maybe that's what this was all for. Not to get rid of the pain, but to become someone who can carry it with such grace that it softens the people around you. Not by fixing them, by showing them they're not alone. So now, as this chapter closes, there's only one thing left to ask. What will you do with the wisdom your wound has given you? Because you are no longer who you were, and you never needed to be. If this journey has spoken to something in you, if you saw your story in these words, leave a trace below. Not just a comment, a mark, a sentence, a word, a line of truth you no longer want to carry in silence. Let it live here. So someone else wandering the way you once did will know they're not walking through the dark alone. And maybe, just maybe, they'll find their first light in the scar you dared to show. Because this isn't the end, it never was. This is the return of the pilgrim who walks not without wounds, but with them, and because of them, with grace.